So, after all that, a happy ending.
Better Call Saul. One of the most discussed, praised, and lauded television dramas of the last decade, and for great reason. And not just because it's a prequel spin-off to maybe the most critically acclaimed TV series of all time, Breaking Bad, but because Better Call Saul stands on its own as one of the most engaging and interesting pieces of television that I've ever seen, from start to finish. And I mean that. This is one of my favorite TV shows of all time, and for a while it was second fiddle to Breaking Bad, but as the show progressed, it only started to show more of its charm, and won many fans over, including me. And trust me, it's not just another Breaking Bad. It's an entirely different kind of show, and I love that about it. While others, well, not so much. Anyways, even though I enjoyed the show, I still didn't think it could top Breaking Bad. Until it just got better and better every season, to the point where, in my opinion, I easily put it over the original series that started it all. And that's by no means an easy feat. Breaking Bad is still a phenomenal TV drama, but that just goes to show how great this series really is. I mean, most good TV shows have at least one or maybe two bad episodes, but honestly I don't think BCS has any. Just some that aren't as strong as some of the others. So today, I decided as a very different kind of video, and as a love letter to one of my favorite series, I would give a personal ranking and review of every episode of Better Call Saul, ranked from worst to best. Don't worry, we've still got Lost Media, gaming stuff, and iceberg content as mainstays on this channel. This is just more of a passion project type of video. Anyways, without further delay, let's get into Better. Number 63, Alpine Shepherd Boy. Now remember, like I said earlier, this show has no bad episodes. This is just one of the weaker ones in my opinion. That being said, there are still some great moments here, like Chuck being tased first of all. Besides that, and the scene in the hospital where we definitively find out Chuck's condition is mental and not physical, there isn't too much else to say. Basically just some of Jimmy's escapades after his billboard stunt. More of a comedic episode for the most part. Also, fun little fact, this episode was originally titled Jello, as the showrunners wanted each title in the season to end in the letter O, but they weren't actually able to use the trademark Jello brand name. Number 62, Talk. So season 4 episode 4, Talk. Basically, we get some eating ASMR, always great, I guess.
Thank you.
But we also do get the origin of the burner phone storyline with Jimmy working at CC Mobile, which is kind of slow but still cool. We also get some more kind of boring stuff with Mike and his daughter-in-law at their support group. The highlight of this episode is definitely this shootout scene where the cousins and Nacho just bust into this rival gang's hideout and shoot everyone like it's a GTA Online mission or something. Not much else to say. A little slow, but not a bad episode by any means. Number 61, Rebecca. Rebecca is a good episode, but it's definitely a very slow one. It mostly focuses on the stories of Chuck and Kim rather than Jimmy, which is fine. We see some montages of Kim getting herself out of the mess at HHM. We also get some stuff with Chuck, and we see a flashback of him even jealous of his brother at a very awkward dinner with his then wife, who the episode is actually named after. And we do later get a scene between just Kim and Chuck, which is nice. Also, Kim does get introduced to Mesa Verde in this episode, which becomes very important, of course, later on in the series. But honestly, the best scene of the episode is the last one, where we see Hector Salamanca walk into the restaurant to meet Mike, before his paralyzed state in Breaking Bad. Really cool to see his character return here. Number 60, Amarillo. Now, this episode may not seem all that impressive, Not too much goes on here, but what we do see is done well, I think, especially this first sequence. Some really good pieces of cinematography here. We also get Jimmy generally being a nuisance to Cliff, running the Sandpiper commercial without his permission. Chuck is also Chuck, and we get a pretty cool cliffhanger ending, with Mike slowly getting more and more involved in the game, meeting his new client Nacho for a hit on a certain somebody. Overall, it's a fine episode, if maybe a little forgettable in the grand scheme of things. Number 59, Black and Blue. Okay, I don't know what's going on with this trend of the 5th episode of these seasons appearing last on this list, but trust me, it won't keep going. I think most of you know why. So anyway, Black and Blue, what can we say about it? Well, first of all, on the plus side, it has one of the most intriguing cold opens and payoffs I've ever seen in a TV show. That being, of course, with the seemingly insignificant item, a slide rule with German text, which eventually leads Lalo to finding out about Gus's secret. Although besides this episode is not too noteworthy. Except for the really tense scene with Lalo breaking into Mrs. Ziegler's house, and the scene with Cliff confronting Howard about his drug use, which eventually makes Howard realize that he's being played by Jimmy. And this leads Howard to getting Jimmy to meet him at a boxing ring, which then leads to one of the most awkward boxing exchanges I've ever seen. I don't really know what it is about it. I mean, it's probably meant to be like that, but I don't know, I wasn't a huge fan of that scene. Although I can see why it's there, you know, knowing what happens to Howard later on. We also do get this seemingly insignificant but very important scene setting up for one of the craziest deaths to a villain I've ever seen. But at the end of the day, it is a setup episode, and it does its job in the story. Number 58, Fifi. This episode is mostly a lawyer battle for Mesa Verde between Kim and Howard, as well as Chuck. Meanwhile, Jimmy gains access to a US Air Force base in order to shoot a commercial in front of a World War II era plane that the episode is named after. And we also, of course, get the great montage of Jimmy switching the Mesa Verde numbers at the copy shop, which ends up being one of the most important actions of his entire life, leading to an insane domino effect of tragedy. The other notable part of this episode is the long take at the beginning, which lasts for an impressive 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Really good stuff. But in terms of content, it's definitely not the most densely packed episode. Number 57, Mabel. In this episode, we get the first truly great Gene scene of the series. Don't worry, there's plenty to come. Big fan of these flash forwards, especially later on. Anyways, in the main timeline, it's still a bit of a slow burn, but honestly, in my opinion, the best part of the episode is the part that some people have a problem with. That being the scene where Mike completely dismantles his car looking for a tracking device, before eventually realizing that it's located inside the gas cap. It's a slow scene, sure, and it may seem like a waste of time, but I honestly like it when they let scenes breathe like this, and let us see a whole story play out completely visually. We can see Mike go through all the effort of trying to find this tracker, and we see his realization in real time. A lesser show would just say he found it in a dialogue sequence, or it would just happen off screen, or he'd just, find it immediately. But Better Call Saul doesn't do that. They don't take the easy way out when writing this show. They find creative solutions to simple problems, and I really love that. Nothing much else to point out here, solid episode overall. Number 56, Axe and Grind. Coming after episode 5 of season 6, Black and Blue, we have Axe and Grind, which along with all of the episodes of season 6 before episode 10, continues the trend of having 2 words with multiple meanings in the title, joined together with the word and. The axe and grind in this case being a literal axe that Lalo uses on the German guy Casper, and of course the famous saying of having an axe to grind with someone, which is the case with Jimmy and Kim against Howard. And the grind could literally be interpreted as the grinding of coffee beans, which Howard does early in the episode. Just thought I would point out these cool details. You might notice some more as we look at other episodes from season 6. Moving on to the actual episode, it's good. We get to see Howard's strained relationship with his wife at home. further giving Howard depth and making us start to feel remorse for everything that's happened to him and will happen to him in the future. We also get the introduction of the Black Book, which we see in the first episode of Season 6. We also get payoff for the ruler in Black and Blue, and also a badass Lalo scene where he uses a razor blade attached to a business card to get the upper hand in a fight. And it's a little goofy, but it is in line with the surreal kind of stuff that Lalo does throughout the show. And then there's the start of the plan against Howard, the beginning of the end, D-Day, which is already thrown into chaos thanks to the judge having a cast. Jimmy then tries to call it all off, but Kim makes the last second call to still go through with it, putting them both down bad choice road. Again, this is another setup episode, a calm before the absolute storm that is Season 6, Episode 7, but it's still a great episode. And it's also notable for being directed by cast member Giancarlo Esposito, who you might recognize as the actor of Gus Fring. Number 55, Marco. The first season finale to appear on this list. This episode actually has quite a bit going for it. We have Jimmy and Howard finally reconciling, although very temporarily, as Jimmy hands off the Sandpiper case to HHM, as Jimmy has finally figured out that it was his brother Chuck who was sabotaging him all along. We also get Jimmy's mental breakdown during bingo, and his Chicago sunroof confession, which seems kind of similar to another scene. But I guess the most significant parts of the episode are in relation to Jimmy's old conning partner Marco, who the episode is named after. We see him briefly in a flashback to before Jimmy moved to Albuquerque to work at HHM, and we see him later in the episode as Jimmy returns to Cicero to visit, where they reunite for a couple more scams, before eventually Marco suddenly dies of a heart attack during their final con. And I don't know, we didn't really know this character too well, and it all just seems kind of surreal, as Jimmy just leaves right after this. Although he does take his ring, which becomes significant later on in the story. Overall, it's a good episode, but it doesn't end on some shocking cliffhanger or anything. Although this scene is definitely the best thing to come out of this episode, where we can clearly see Jimmy's character change from the beginning of the season to the final episode. Perfect way to end the episode in my opinion. Not one of my favorite episodes, but this is probably one of my favorite moments throughout the entire series. Number 54, Something Stupid. Ah yes, the first Something episode of the bunch. So this episode has a huge time skip of 8 months, which we can see play out through both Kim and Jimmy's lives in an amazing montage sequence. But the best scene here, we all know, is our boy Huel just trying to protect everyone's favorite lawyer, not realizing that the guy he just took out was a cop. Yeah, it's a whole thing, and I love it, as it sets up one of the coolest scams in the entire series in the next episode. And I love that it's Kim that instigates it at the end of the episode. Number 53, Quite a Ride. Of course, as soon as you start this episode, you're hit with a pretty shocking sight. As for the first time in the show, we are in the Breaking Bad timeline, complete with the original office that Saul Goodman used in Breaking Bad. It's a pretty cool scene, and of course offers foreshadowing of scenes in the later half of the final season that determine the end of Jimmy's story. Kind of random to include it here in the middle of Season 4, but any foreshadowing of any kind that pays off is appreciated in my book. We also get Jimmy starting his burner phone business, which of course also connects to Breaking Bad, as we can see his desk full of phones in the flash forward this episode. We also get another great interaction between Howard and Jimmy, who I swear just have the most interesting dynamic in the entire series, and every scene they share together is just amazing. And we can clearly see here the trend continuing of Jimmy pushing his guilt onto Howard, and even tries to give him the number of a therapist that Kim suggested Jimmy go see. Although after hearing Howard is already seeing someone, he rips up the note and flushes it down the toilet. And of course this is also the beginning of the Super Lab Project storyline. Overall, very solid episode, but most notable for the Breaking Bad flash forward. Number 52, Expenses. Season 3, Episode 7, Expenses, is basically a series of unfortunate events that just keep happening to Jimmy, as he tries his best to complete his community service and commit to real work in the form of his TV ads, which don't go too well for him. First, he only gets a fraction of his community service time because he was taking calls while working, Then of course he's behind on expenses at home, and also he can barely get a couple of TV gigs. And actually does one for free and has to pay his crew for their work anyway. And his car even breaks down. Also, any scene with Daniel Warmold, aka Price, aka Lester from GTA, is great. This is also the episode with the incredible scene of Jimmy messing with Chuck's insurance. Just an amazing performance by Bob Odenkirk, and an amazing way to end off the episode. You almost feel like Jimmy here could be being genuine after all he's went through this episode, this season, hell even the whole show up to this point, until you see as he leaves the office that iconic triumphant smile after pulling off a successful scam. Number 51, Smoke. For the premiere of Season 4, we get a pretty low-key episode considering what went down in the Season 3 finale. It's a disturbing calmness and quietness. We don't get a distraught and frantic Jimmy here, like you might expect, but a cold and distant one, at least at first glance. It's in pretty stark contrast to the opening sequence with Gene, which picks up after he had his panic attack, where he's paranoid about being caught. And of course, we get the first introduction to Jeff the cab driver. Back in the main timeline, we see Jimmy try to hide his feelings and guilt throughout the grieving process, as we see him come to the realization that it was his actions that caused Chuck's death, as Howard deduces that Chuck ended himself because of the issues with the malpractice insurance, which was directly caused by Jimmy out of spite for his brother. But I absolutely love this scene because instead of admitting his guilt, he pushes it all onto Howard.
Well, Howard, I guess that's your cross to bear.
Which is something he will keep doing for almost the entirety of the series, as a way to cope with the death of Chuck. Great stuff, and an amazing ending to the episode. Number 50, Pinata. First of all, an amazing sequence and such a satisfying revenge against those guys that robbed him in the previous episode, quite a ride. Also, the Superlab storyline really starts to get going here this episode, but we all know the star scene of this is Jimmy getting the check from Howard. Jimmy being able to rile Howard up and just push the right buttons is so great to watch, and leads to one of the only times that Howard lost his cool in the series.
F*** you, Jimmy.
However, as we know, this scene is much more tragic as you get further into the story. Still, it's an outstanding scene with really great performances. Number 49, Switch. This episode is really interesting, and like the title suggests, it kind of subverts the audience expectations in every way. At the end of the season, it looked as if Jimmy turned around and left, never meeting with Howard and Cliff. But in reality, we do see him meet up with them, and the scene with Mike just takes place after he left their meeting. Also surprisingly, after all this time and everything he's been through, Jimmy doesn't take the job at Davis and Maine. Now, when this aired, I know a lot of people were upset by this because it seemed like this was all Jimmy ever wanted, and yeah, from the context of Season 1, it would seem that way. But as we come to find out later on, context is important, and I think this decision is only strengthened by the later episodes, which let us learn a lot more about Jimmy's complex and layered character. I don't think he wanted to just be a lawyer. He wanted to be loved and respected by the person he cared about and respected most, his brother Chuck. Besides that, not too much goes on in this season's Gene scene, although we do see the lengths that he goes to in order to not be made. Also, seeing these two interact is always great also.
But I like it. I mean, I'm proud of it.
And I think it's funny that Nacho said he likes to rip off thieves because they have no recourse, but as we know, Price is so dumb that he called the cops anyway. Also, how can you forget to mention the start of Kim and Jimmy's cons, which is born thanks to this dude, who you might also recognize from a small scene in Breaking Bad where Walt blows up his car. And all's well that ends well, as Jimmy ends up taking the job in the end. So yeah, pretty great season premiere in my eyes. Number 48, Inflatable. This is actually the moment that Slippin' Jimmy is born. In a flashback sequence, we can see one of the most formative events in possibly Jimmy's life, as we see a random dude steal from his dad, and he learns here to either be a wolf or a sheep. Also, I absolutely love this scene with Jimmy and Mike. I mean, I love every scene with these two, their chemistry is just so funny.
You take the next one. And bill me.
This episode also has one of, if not the best montage sequences of the entire series, with Jimmy trying to get himself fired from Davis and Maine by wearing various wacky suits and just generally doing crazy stuff. It's just so fun and so like Jimmy. Also, he somehow gets his Cocobolo desk back in the nail salon. Great stuff. Number 47, Bali High. So I would say most people know, if they've seen the entire series, that Better Call Saul has some of the best visual storytelling out there. And this episode is a good early showcase of that. While some of the examples might be on the nose here, the various ways we can see that Jimmy doesn't fit in his new job position are great. Whether it be the coffee mug, which literally doesn't fit in the company car cup holder, or even the company apartment, which he isn't comfortable sleeping in. It's these pieces of that classic show don't tell type of storytelling that I really admire about this show, and don't worry, examples of this only get better as the series progresses. In other news, we get Kim initiating a con rather than Jimmy, which is interesting. Also, we get an amazing scene with Mike setting up a Death Note-like trap to see if anyone enters his home in a pretty genius way. And I love that Mike just asks,
What's the message?
We also see the cousins threatening Mike's granddaughter at the motel, which leads to a confrontation with Hector and an intense hatred for the Salamancas, which brews for several seasons. Also, the scene with Hector and Mike, great stuff. And I love that it took Mike's granddaughter and an extra $50K on top to even reach this deal. And even with that, he still went after this guy. He holds grudges almost as long as a certain other character I know. Number 46, Bingo. Kind of a slow episode, but still a damn good one in my opinion. We can see the brothers still on good terms, which is nice to see for once. And Chuck actually trying to get better. We also get some Cocobolo desk foreshadowing for no reason, but hey, we'll take it. The scene of Mike stealing the money from the Kettlemans is also great and unique, just like every solution that Mike comes up with. Also, Jimmy confronting the Kettlemans is just so satisfying to watch. And I also like Jimmy using Nacho's quote about criminals having no recourse. This is something that we see Jimmy do a few times throughout the series, and also let me just say these two play these roles perfectly. All around fun side characters. But probably my favorite part is Jimmy giving back his share of the money to make it complete. And when asked by Mike about what he's doing, he says in air quotes, the right thing. It's nice to have this kind of milestone, as we see in the finale of the season that he clearly regrets this decision, and that what stopped him is never stopping him again. Number 45, Cobbler. I mentioned this before, but yeah, anything involving this guy is great. And this scene with Nacho trading the baseball cards for his new car is just hilarious.
No. You think I'd be caught dead driving that thing? It looks like a school bus for 6-year-old pimps.
All right, shall we move this along?
And the ultimate conclusion to this storyline is just as weird and funny. We see Jimmy hired as Price's attorney, and for some reason he comes up with the strangest, most elaborate lie ever, which the cops actually end up buying. But honestly, the most important character introduced in this episode is a coffee mug, who actually survives a lot longer than some of these characters, despite also being shot multiple times. Number 44, Sabrosito. It's kind of a slower episode, but it's still a good one. We get a flashback to Don Eladio's, showing Hector's jealousy over Gus, as well as him disrupting Los Pollos' business with the introduction of the show's best character, Lyle.
You passed the bar?
I thought that you want to know.
What a sick joke!
But this scene right here is just awesome. I never thought these two would ever meet, and the way Mike just turns on power tools whenever Chuck tries to approach is just great. Also, the ending scene is pretty good too, but mostly just set up for the coming episode. Number 43, Hero. We get the first appearance of Slippin' Jimmy in this episode, and it's okay, a little drawn out for my taste, but it does foreshadow some future events. And also, this episode just generally has some slow pacing, but the content here is still good. I really do like Jimmy being hesitant to take the bribe, but ultimately taking it, and rationalizing his decision to himself. It's a great character building scene and helps lay out the roadmap that is his character via these small milestones, through these moments, like in episode 7 and episode 10 where we can see his mindset changing. We also get a great subversion of the last time Nacho and Jimmy talked in episode 3, where Nacho was intimidating Jimmy. But as we can see now, the tables have turned, and Jimmy isn't scared of him. Also, we get the great billboard stunt, which also introduces some great characters into the show in the form of the camera crew, who you'll pretty much see throughout the rest of the series. This scene is also great because it just shows how far Jimmy plans ahead, which is of course a trait of his that will come out throughout the whole series from here on out. And of course at the end, Chuck ends up finding out about the shenanigans that his brother is up to when he steals the newspaper. Great episode. Number 42. Wine and Roses. Lots of great shots to be found in this episode. And of course, throughout the whole series, but this season in particular, they just really went all out, as evidenced by the first episode of season 6. But this episode is a little slow paced, which is absolutely fine. I mean, especially because the next episode aired right after this one, like the next day. The opening sequence is very notable in this episode and really cool because not only is it very well shot, but it also foreshadows many story beats, including things that happen in the final episode. But also it's not a Gene flash forward. Instead, it's presumably in the Breaking Bad timeline, as we get to see Saul's house for the first time, and wow, yeah, it's definitely Saul Goodman's house. Amazing opening scene, really creative stuff. The rest of the episode is still good, although some parts are a little clunky in my opinion. Although I do love this country club scene. Bravo to Bob Odenkirk for this acting here. Number 41. Something Beautiful. Alright, the second something of the list. Something Beautiful. And speaking of beautiful, this episode has some particularly beautiful shots. I mean, the cinematography is always top notch, but just look at some of these. For other cool stuff, we get some subtle foreshadowing, or more like reasoning for why Caldera would end up giving the Black Book to Jimmy, as against his better judgment, he lets Jimmy talk to his contact and convince him to take his job offer. And we soon find out that that guy is actually Ira, who you might remember from his brief appearance in Breaking Bad. This whole thing with stealing these figures is really just cool also because of the subtle build-up throughout the series, from their seemingly insignificant first appearance in Season 1, to when they are seen again in Season 4 at one of Jimmy's job interviews. This episode just has a lot of interesting and cool details and callbacks. Also, this little distraction and heist of the figures is really just great. But that's not it. We also have a great scene in covering up Arturo's death, as Victor and Tyrus make it look like an attack, and even shoot Nacho twice, which he barely ends up surviving anyway. Although it did make it look real, I guess. But that's not even all. I know, it's like an infomercial right now. We also get Jimmy and Kim reading Chuck's letter, which we can see makes Kim very emotional, but barely affects Jimmy at all, at least visibly. I say it a lot, but that's because it's deserved. Great performances here, especially Rhea Seehorn. Number 40. Off-brand. Here we see the brutal aftermath of the iconic chicanery. And this episode will probably always live in its shadow, but it's still a great one on its own. We see Chuck is completely defeated and embarrassed by his display at the courtroom, and it's kinda dumb that Rebecca comes to Jimmy asking him to help get into his brother's house. Like, first of all, why would Chuck open the door for Jimmy of all people after what he just did? Second, why would Jimmy want to help Chuck after his countless betrayals? I guess that's what makes this so satisfying in my opinion.
Yeah. No.
Howard also shows he truly cares, which is really telling of his true character, despite what most of the other characters think about him at this point in the series. And he manages to talk Chuck into moving forward past his vendetta, at least for the time being. We get another great montage as well, with Jimmy going through all his clients and canceling any prior arrangements with them as he is taking a quote sabbatical from the law. In another hilarious twist, we also see Jimmy make a commercial for selling commercials in order to pay for his end of their office, as he's having trouble finding clients for his new business. And of course we know he can't actually use his lawyer image, so the official Saul Goodman is born, which is of course awesome. And Kim describes him as having a lot of energy, to which Jimmy drops this bomb of a line.
It's just a name.
Which is just about one of the biggest lies he's ever told, even if he didn't know it yet. Also, the stuff with Nacho in this episode is great too. He beats up Domingo, which we can see actually affects him, but it was something that needed to be done in order to satisfy Hector and uphold his rough cartel image. He also has to do this in getting an extra brick for Hector, which almost gets him killed. Although Gus does allow it and reveals to the audience him coming across and buying the laundromat, which will become the location of the Super Lab, along with a cameo appearance from Lydia, which is cool too. Quite a lot going on here in just this one episode, and I quite like that about it. While I like my slow burn scenes, I can appreciate some faster paced storytelling, and I think this episode handles that well. Number 39, Slip. We all know by now that props are just as important as the characters in this show, maybe even more so at times. And a very important one is introduced here in the form of the Band-Aid box in a Slippin' Jimmy flashback. Speaking of Slippin' Jimmy, he literally returns for a slip and fall con after the music store owners refuse to pay for their commercial. Good stuff there. We also get a great character-defining moment for Mike, as what he did resulted in the death of an innocent person, someone outside of the game, which informs a lot of the actions he does later on in the series, but obviously the show stealer here was the scene of Nacho swapping the pills. Such a tense and amazingly directed scene, as well as well acted by Michael Mando. Honestly, just for that amazing scene with such reverberating consequences for both series, this episode gets bumped up a decent amount on my list. Number 38, Sunk Costs.
It's not in my interest for Hector Salamanca to die at this time.
God, I just love the way he says that. Anyways, yeah, Mike is finally introduced formally to Gus through his encounters with Hector. Remember, I told you, this man could hold a grudge, but he met the man whose grudge ran even deeper. This episode also shows us another one of Mike's genius schemes, and there's plenty in this show, but this one is just so good that I honestly forgot what he was using these shoes for during my rewatch, until we eventually see how he put the drugs in there and shot the shoes in order to get the residue on the trucks, which of course hurts Hector's business. Bravo, Vince. God, and this scene just hurts your soul when you watch it. Chuck is such a prick to Jimmy. So on one hand, it's satisfying to hear Jimmy lay down the truth to his brother, which did end up happening. But it's at the same time sad because, well, it was the truth. Jimmy is arrested after this and begins to represent himself before Kim steps in to help him. Very sweet moment. Unfortunately, Chuck also commits an even worse sin by firing Ernesto, and this is pretty much the last we see of him besides a small flashback appearance, which hurts. He was one of the only genuinely nice and loyal people in the entire show. We get another iconic scene of these two smoking cigarettes just like in the first episode and the finale, and this scene is great as well. I love that Kim is sticking by Jimmy here, and it's shot amazing too, by the way. Number 37, Rico. Here in episode 8 of season 1, we have just a really solid episode. We get the start of the giant sandpiper case, which basically becomes the most prevalent and important court case in the entire series, as it eventually leads to Saul's mansion seen in the premiere of season 6, and it also has many close ties to other major story beats of the series. There's also a lot of funny moments sprinkled throughout this episode, especially that hilarious dumpster scene, as well as the talk with Rich Swikart. Also, it's nice to see Chuck and Jimmy bonding for once, even if it's short-lived and Chuck is still actively sabotaging Jimmy. Still, it's a nice calm before the storm. Also, some really great soundtracks in here. I mean, this show just has a fantastic score in general, but some of the soundtracks in this episode are especially great. Number 36, Hit and Run. Starting it off here, this episode has a really interesting and seemingly random cold open, with a couple we've never seen before returning from a bike ride. Nothing too out of the ordinary, which in this universe is actually quite strange. But it is revealed that this house is actually used as an elaborate setup by Gus Fring to conduct surveillance on his house and the neighborhood. We also get a great and very interestingly put together scheme with Jimmy disguising himself as Howard, while the real Howard is visiting his psychologist, which Jimmy uses as an opportunity to actually steal his car by making a duplicate key. And it's all kind of a convoluted process, but in a good way, in a very entertaining way. Anyway, the scheme works perfectly, and Jimmy is just barely able to get back in time, in a funny scene where he has to move the parking post. Also, there's some cool cameos from Breaking Bad here, such as Wendy as the one that Jimmy throws out of the car, and Spooge, who is waiting at Jimmy's office along with many other criminals seeking his representation, as we can now see how his criminal lawyer reputation really got started. Also, Mike and Kim meet for the first time, and he chooses to tell her about Lalo being alive, rather than Jimmy, which I thought was cool, seeing how much of a spaz Jimmy can be at times. Also, almost forgot to mention, this is Rhea Seehorn's directorial debut for the show, and she did a great job. This is a really solid and fun episode. Number 35, Breathe. So the part that most people are going to remember about this episode is the ending where, after backing up Arturo and getting an extra brick, Nacho is actually ambushed by Gus and his men, with Gus himself actually killing Arturo in an incredibly brutal fashion, and claiming ownership over Nacho after confronting him about what he did to Hector. Amazing ending to the episode. But the other standout scene is even better in my opinion. We have Kim confronting Howard after Chuck's death, and the scene is just amazing. Such an organic and heart-wrenching performance by Rhea Seehorn, and of course great job to Patrick Fabian as well, playing such a misunderstood character. He really played it perfectly for rewatches of the show with additional context. Number 34, Dedicado a Max. It's definitely saying something to the quality of Season 5 that this is the first episode to appear yet from that season, and it's a great episode at that. This is the one where Jimmy creates several delays in Mesa Verde's plans for Mr. Acker's estate, which is just an all-around funny and brilliant scene. A standout of all Jimmy's schemes this season for sure. We also see why Gus is so keen on getting Mike to work with him here, as well as a reference to Max from Breaking Bad. That was cool too. And we get the return of Trevor Phillips this episode. Mr. X. Yeah. Anyway, fun episode. Number 33, Fall. This episode shows a lot of the consequences of Jimmy's actions throughout the season. We get to see his reaction to how much he will make if the Sandpiper case is settled, and we get to see the reverberating consequences of Chuck's outburst on HHM, which leads to Howard suggesting that he should retire. But light on the suggestion, more like he's forced out of HHM, which eventually does lead to Chuck's death. We see Jimmy at one of his highest points by that time in the series, and Chuck at his absolute lowest. And after that, we get another great Howard and Jimmy confrontation, this time with Howard on the attack seeing through Jimmy's scheme. It's great stuff, and Jimmy this episode is just wildin', lying to literally everybody, including these old ladies. It's painful to watch, but I gotta admit, I love seeing this side of Jimmy. The early stages of Saul Goodman, if you will. And don't worry, his elder abuse here will catch up to him in the long run. Also, this scene with Kim is... yeah, very shocking. I really like how they edited this together, but yeah, it's pretty much an actual jump scare. Number 32, Carrot and Stick. Carrot and Stick is a really interesting episode. One of those ones where the opening scene just leaves you confused, in a good way. And don't worry, it does pay off later. Nacho, meanwhile, is hiding out in a motel while the cousins and some other hitmen are after him. Mike and Tyrus also have a confrontation, which is pretty cool. And the Kettlemans also return, as well as the inflatable Statue of Liberty from Breaking Bad. And interestingly, it's never fully shown how Saul acquired it, but I guess he just bought it from them. At least they do show it here though. Also, the scene where Kim is the one to threaten the Kettlemans is great stuff. Number 31, Uno. And finally we have the first episode of the series, Uno. Yes, it's a very slow pilot episode, but that's kind of what I love about it. Most shows today have to hook you in with an action-filled, fast-paced riot of an episode, kinda like Breaking Bad did. which there's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes it's refreshing to see a more slow-paced drama, a slow burn, which is exactly what Better Call Saul is. It really takes its time. It's not just a Breaking Bad prequel. It stands on its own as something different. And I love that about this show and this episode, which established this sort of pace for the rest of the series. Some got put off by this, but at least they don't lie to you in the first episode. It shows you exactly what you're in for. Anyway, we get caught up with Saul after the events of Breaking Bad, and he's right where he said he would be, managing a Cinnabon in Omaha, Nebraska. Although his world is devoid of color, the fun times are over. But then we get to see Jimmy, not Saul, but Jimmy's very humble beginnings as a lawyer, and it's great. We also get to meet the other main characters like Kim and Mike, and through short introductions, we're able to learn about these characters very organically. I especially like the scene with Mike and the stickers. Perfectly encapsulates his character in my opinion. Not only that, we also get a pretty great cliffhanger, with Jimmy coming face to face with Tuco himself. Overall, a really good episode, and in my opinion, even better after watching the whole series. Number 30. Click. The season finale of Season 2 is a good one. First, we get a flashback of Jimmy and Chuck at their mother's deathbed, which I actually thought was good. I'm not usually a huge fan of flashbacks, but this one is done well and explains quite a bit about Chuck's character in a pretty organic way. I also love how devoted Jimmy is to his brother this episode. Even after all that's happened between them, he still does love his brother. Ernesto also continues to be the GOAT in this episode. But we all know the big scene at the end is the highlight, and it's such a devastating scene. Watching Jimmy get duped by Chuck like this actually hurts. And it's pretty messed up considering he not only uses Jimmy's emotions against him, but he also literally cons Jimmy, manipulating him into admitting he switched the numbers. Truly a painful scene. Number 29, 50% off. Starting it off, this episode has one of the most wild montages ever, featuring two drug addicts going on a crime binge because of Saul offering a 50% discount on his lawyer fees, which also indirectly leads to a cascade of events that affects basically all of the major characters in this episode related to the cartel side of things, which I really liked. This leads to Domingo, aka Crazy 8, being arrested, which they even came up with an origin story for that name, which was cool.
Mucho loco, this guy, huh?
And it leads to Nacho gaining Lalo's trust by managing to get into the drug house and taking back their drugs, which eventually leads to Saul being Domingo's attorney in the next episode, so it all comes full circle, which is really cool. Number 28, Gloves Off. First of all, I like the way this episode was structured. They've done this before, but I can appreciate them showing the aftermath of an episode before revealing what actually happened. It works well as a hook. And not only is the payoff good of a scene where you would never expect these two characters to meet, but the planning and execution in general are just fantastic. I love the conversation Mike and Nacho have planning the whole thing, going through all the details. That's something I've always admired about this universe. It's very meticulous in its details. Also, we can see Mike's character start to shift a little bit from this point onward, as Nacho points out how he went through much more effort for less money just to not kill Tuco, something which Mike would have no qualms about doing later down the line. It's definitely a turning point and a notable milestone in Mike's character arc. Number 27, the guy for this. Now when it comes to this Mike scene, I'm not really a fan. He gets threatened by some guys and twists the arm of one of them, which scares like a group of 6 dudes. Like, I get Mike is a badass, but he's not invincible. You guys could just jump this man. I don't know, it's kind of weird. For me, I prefer the scenes where Mike outsmarts his opponents rather than just beating them through physical strength, considering he's, like 60 plus. But to be fair, the rest of the episode more than makes up for this small portion. First of all, we get the return of Hank and Gomez, although there's a little prequel immersion breaking going on here, because this dude is supposed to be like 38 here, which, yikes. But I don't really let it bother me too much, and in fact the scenes with Hank are great, especially this one with these 4 people meeting in the same room. I don't know, this kind of just blew my mind the first time I watched it. Also, the scene with Nacho and his father was great stuff too. And really good acting by Juan Carlos Cantu as Nacho's father, in this scene especially, but also just in general. Number 26, 5-0. Okay, I know this may be a controversial take putting it here on the list, but hear me out, alright? First, let me just remind you that this is a great episode of television, to even be in this show at all, but also to be this far down the list. It's just not one of my personal favorites, although I can see why it is for many, especially for those whose favorite character is Mike. Basically, this whole episode is solely devoted to him and his backstory, concerning his criminal origin as well as the death of his son Matty, who was also a police officer that Mike ended up corrupting and was killed anyway, which Mike ends up seeking revenge for before moving to Albuquerque. It's really great stuff, but everyone knows the pinnacle of this episode is that final monologue. Insanely good acting by Jonathan Banks and a very sad scene.
Broke my boy. I broke my boy.
Was not expecting such an emotional display from such a cold and calculating character. Also, remember how Mexico is yellow? Well, this episode we learn that Philadelphia is blue as hell. Number 25, Wiedersehen. We start the episode with a classic Slippin' Kimmy and Jimmy scheme.
Nice.
Jimmy also isn't reinstated due to a lack of apparent remorse, which is because Jimmy didn't talk about the death of his own brother, Chuck, which is something Jimmy neglected as he had pushed the guilt and thought of his brother's death so far out of his mind that he didn't even think to bring it up, which leads to a heated argument between Kim and Jimmy. Great stuff there, really well acted. Another Breaking Bad character is introduced this episode. Well, not really a character, but it might as well be one. Hector's iconic bell.
I'm the man who killed Gus Fring.
Also, the German guys blow some stuff up, and Werner goes missing. And Lalo has his first confrontation with the Chicken Man himself. Pretty great episode. Number 24, Magic Man. Really good season premiere in my opinion, maybe the best of the entire series. First off, we have a great Gene sequence, and we get everyone's favorite cab driver being a creep. And I just love this portrayal here by Don Harvey. It comes off very different from Pat Healy's version, but we'll get into that a bit later. Also, this part is sick.
I'm gonna fix it myself.
Back in the present time, Jimmy has gone full-on Saul Goodman, rocking the crazy suits and selling the burner phones. This time with the intent to turn his customer base into future clients, along with the help of Huel, which is great. Lalo also meets Mike, and it's quite the interaction.
I'm gonna get back to it.
Thank you, Michael.
Wow.
That explains everything.
And Lalo also remains suspicious of Gus over the Werner situation, prompting Gus to cease construction of the lab for the time being. I just really like how this episode sets up future conflicts and storylines in a very organic, but more importantly entertaining way.
Burner.
Number 23, Mijo. Speaking of the world's greatest lawyer, this is when that title was cemented for him. The iconic scene in the desert where, as he himself so eloquently put it,
Hey, I just talked you down from a death sentence to 6 months probation. I'm the best lawyer ever.
But yeah, really, what can be said about this episode that hasn't been said already? It continues immediately after the end of the pilot where Tuco kidnaps Jimmy and the twins, and what follows is an amazing display of Jimmy's charisma and intelligence, which saves his life as well as the twins. This scene also introduces Nacho into the story, and we get to learn a lot about him as well just from this interaction. Also,
Stop helping.
fucking hilarious that Tuco still hated this dude even back then, but shout out to these two for even getting a cameo here. Anyways, yeah, this scene is great, it's tense as hell, and it's almost half the episode. It's also a great character milestone for Jimmy, as you can clearly see that he has morality in mind, as he couldn't just leave those boys to die at the hands of Tuco. A far cry from Mr. Trip to Belize, Saul Goodman. Also, there's one of the earliest montages in the series here, and a great scene with Nacho that really makes him seem intimidating, almost like a villain. Although he does eventually become one of the most sympathetic characters in the entire show. Number 22, Namaste. Namaste. This episode is just great. First, we get these two dudes that went on their spree after getting Saul's 50% off cards, which is fun stuff. But more importantly, we get Jimmy's lunch with Howard, with Jimmy not wanting to accept the offer for a number of reasons, leading to one of the best scenes in the show, but that comes later. Also, he throws some bowling balls at Howard's car. We also get this iconic line this episode.
A man fucking a horse.
And Saul manages to represent Acker in the case against Mesa Verde. We also get Hank seizing the dead drops, which is great, and Mike is stabbed by those guys he beat up, waking up in a random location, as all good Rockstar missions start.
I was doing something stupid.
In summary, a really fun episode for Saul Goodman. Number 21, Koshada. This one right here, I feel, is a very underrated episode. Not only is this the episode that the most iconic villain from the show is introduced in, which is done in an amazing way with incredible foreshadowing by the way, but also this is the one where Jimmy and Kim managed to get Huel out of trouble with the cop from the previous episode. This is one of my favorite schemes of the entire series, as Jimmy writes a ton of letters and sends them to the judge, having a different phone for each letter in case the DA calls asking about it, which is a good way to use Jimmy's access to all of his phones, and him and his camera crew are ready to put on voices to imitate the callers. It's great and super creative, what else can I say? Nacho also acts like a boss this episode, literally, but that doesn't last long as we get the Lalo reveal, which is just an amazing scene. We've even got Nacho's death foreshadowed here. And I'm just left thinking both of these amazing characters are here right now in this show because of a literal throwaway line from Breaking Bad. Crazy stuff. Number 20, Bagman. Everyone knows and loves this episode. Honestly, you might be surprised that it's not in the top 10 or 5 for me, but still, I really do like this episode, and I really appreciate what it is. That being that it's essentially a Breaking Bad episode set in Better Call Saul. And I'm not talking timelines here, that comes later. I mean just how off the wall and crazy it is. It's basically the opposite of an episode like Chicanery, but that's okay, as it definitely stands out for being so different from the rest of the series. Also, it's just a pretty big undertaking for an episode in general. Apparently it took 18 days to film, twice as long as a standard episode for the show. Anyway, you all know what happens here. Jimmy is tasked with collecting money for Lalo's bail, and all hell breaks loose in a super tense scene where Jimmy is almost killed by cartel members. And if we didn't know about Breaking Bad, this would be even more tense, but still, this scene is wild, as Jimmy is barely saved by Mike, which we can see from his perspective. And from then on, Jimmy's car breaks down, and him and Mike have to try to make it back on foot. Can't forget that also great scene with Kim and Lalo. All in all, a really good set piece type episode. Number 19, Something Unforgivable. At the 19th slot, we have the season finale of Season 5, Something Unforgivable. Gus sends assassins after Lalo, which Nacho lets into the house in a really interesting and creative way, using a cast iron pan filled with oil, which causes smoke and draws Lalo away from him. And this also works great because he ends up using that pan filled with hot oil as a weapon later, really showing how resourceful Lalo truly is, as he comes up with a plan to take out all of the hitmen, wrapping back around through the secret exit, which we actually see him come up with in that exact moment, which is great. And I really prefer moments like this where the character is able to win based on previous knowledge or by outsmarting their enemies, over something like that scene in The Guy for This, where we just get away from the situation because, well, plot. Not to hit on that scene too much, it just really makes me appreciate a smart fight sequence like this that keeps that plausibility. The rest of what happens in the episode is less noteworthy, except of course for the Kim Wexler finger guns, the Saul Goodman moment of the season, as they finally decide to take down Howard. Speaking of, also that scene where Kim laughed at Howard kind of felt good in the moment, but yeah, Howard was kinda spitting facts here. He's pretty much been doing that the entire series, but yeah, by the time we realized it, it was already too late. Number 18, Nailed. First off, we get another great and maybe one of the most important milestones in Mike's character, which is in relation to the truck heist at the very beginning of the episode. which Nacho is able to deduce was done by Mike due to the truck driver not being killed, which in turn caused the death of an innocent person, or someone who wasn't in the game, which is something that deeply affects Mike, as he later on in the series has no qualms with killing anyone involved in the criminal underworld, those in the game, if you will. But innocent people are off limits. Jimmy's plan to get Mesa Verde to leave HHM and go to Kim also works, which Chuck recognizes was the work of none other than his brother. Also, Kim basically hits the nail on the head here, pun intended, with their relationship, as Chuck is too blinded by his own distaste for Jimmy to recognize that all he wanted was Chuck's approval, leading to this negative feedback loop that they have. Because in a way, Chuck is the reason that Jimmy is the way that he is, and I love that. But after this speech defending Jimmy, she knows that he really did switch the numbers. And of course, who can forget the scene where Chuck confronts the store owner who Jimmy paid off, where all his symptoms seemingly hit him at once, seeing all the electronics around him, leading to a devastating head injury and a cliffhanger ending. Number 17, Pimento. Alright, so welcome back to my playthrough of GTA 6. In this episode we play as Mike, taking some missions from Lester and working alongside Trevor. Truly a crazy crossover. No, but seriously, there is no way that these two being on screen together isn't some sort of Easter egg or reference or something. Anyway, everyone remembers this iconic scene. Mike destroys Trevor and scares away Mountain Man, being the only bodyguard for Lester. Sorry, I mean Price. Through these interactions is also how Mike meets Nacho, which is cool. And honestly, this Price story arc, as kind of goofy as it is, I gotta say I'm a big fan. Chuck also returns to HHM and convinces Jimmy to give the Sandpiper case to them, and even gets Howard to take the blame for not hiring him, even though it is him that doesn't want Jimmy to be hired. It's so brutal to watch, and it's amazing because you can tell upon rewatch Howard really doesn't want to say what he's saying. It's crazy how much of a snake Chuck truly is in this scene, acting like the caring and upset brother, while actually being the one to sabotage him. Incredibly good acting here. Specifically, this line delivery by Bob is just amazing.
Go to hell, Howard. I'm not giving you my case.
You can tell he just feels so uncomfortable and disappointed. Also, I do like that they double down on making Howard seem like the villain here with the Kim scene, even though upon rewatch you can also tell that he immediately regrets what he says. Also, Jimmy realizing that it was Chuck by seeing his phone dead is great visual storytelling. Not to mention the ultimate confrontation at the end of the episode between the two brothers, where the true villain is finally revealed. Number 16, Witness. Fring's back. That's all, moving on. Nah, just kidding, but isn't it wild that they put that in as an Easter egg using the episode titles? And if you didn't know about that going in, the scene where Los Pollos Hermanos and Gus are introduced are even more shocking and just awesome. It's also the first introduction of Francesca too, who also has a pretty good character arc throughout the show, surprisingly, for a supporting character. And it's also the first appearance of Victor as well in BCS. And it's also the origin of the "put a dollar in my pocket" line from Breaking Bad, which is actually something that Kim does with Jimmy. So many great appearances and references to Breaking Bad in this episode. I also love seeing Mike's plan play out through Jimmy, with the discussion of the plan being the narration over the scene. It just makes the whole thing so much more fun. It's also great to see Jimmy so out of his element for a change, which is something that Gus notices. Although this is still the best lawyer ever we're talking about, so he manages to weasel his way out of the situation. It's also so heartwarming how much fun Jimmy has working with Mike here. And of course, as a perfect contrast to this, we have Jimmy's confrontation with his real big brother, who he completely freaks out at, and for good reason, culminating in this incredible scene which also has major implications for the rest of the season.
Number 15, Burger King foot lettuce.
I'm sorry, I'm just kidding. Number 15, Bad Choice Road. Continuing the chaos of Bagman, we have Bad Choice Road, which basically just concerns the aftermath of that episode in the best way possible. Jimmy and Mike make it out of the desert, but both Lalo and Kim are suspicious of his story, as we get the striking imagery of Kim finding the lawyer mug with a bullet hole in it. We also get a tense scene of Lalo investigating what happened in the desert, with another surreal Lalo scene of him jumping onto Jimmy's car, followed by an even more tense confrontation in the apartment, where Kim luckily comes to Jimmy's defense in an amazing yet terrifying sequence. Number 14. Nacho. My favorite episode from Season 1, which might kind of be surprising, but I really do think this is a criminally underrated episode. It has so much tension, drama, and mystery packed into just one episode. Jimmy has a moral dilemma with the Kettlemans and is stuck between doing the right thing and keeping himself safe from Nacho, who, speaking of, is being the intimidating villain here, which is great. They really make him look ominous in this scene. And the evolution of this character is really something to behold when you come back to see this episode. Number 13. Fun and Games. In a lot of ways, this episode feels like a series finale, and in a way it kind of is. Not literally, of course, but it is the end of an era, the end of the Better Call Saul timeline. It's very slow paced, but at the same time, the transition between this timeline and the Breaking Bad one seems so abrupt, and I mean that in a good way. Of course, the breakup scene between Kim and Jimmy is heartbreaking and terrifically performed, but it also just makes perfect sense. Also, the Perfect Day montage is also one of the best in the entire series. And that final shot, wow. It really has the audience feeling the opposite of what they expected to when this moment arrived. We aren't hyped to see Saul Goodman. Okay, maybe on some level we are. But more importantly, we're feeling the full tragedy of Jimmy McGill and the downfall of a once good man. Great episode, and honestly, if we didn't have the Gene timeline going on, this could have been the ending, and I would have probably been satisfied. Number 12. Lantern. Alright, this is a wild episode. First, the biggie, of course. Chuck dies a horrifying death, burning himself and his house down in the process, which was very shocking when it happened. Especially after seeing Jimmy visit with Chuck having all the electronics in his house on. But that's not all this episode is. The drama and build-up between Howard and Chuck was also great, and it was so satisfying to see Howard finally stand up to Chuck for once. Also, side note, there's a Blockbuster cameo in this episode, which is just cool and hella nostalgic. It's also interesting that Chuck and Jimmy talk about regrets, as we know in the final episode that's kind of a big thing. But also, this line is just such a gut punch from Chuck.
You've never mattered all that much to me.
And it's so sad that this was one of the last things he ever said to his brother. Such a tragic and sad episode all around. Seeing Chuck mentally and Jimmy emotionally break this episode is just heartbreaking, and despite how annoying he could be, Chuck really was a great character and a part of the reason that Jimmy became Saul Goodman. Number 11. Wexler v. Goodman. With such an ominous title, this episode might have surprised you like it did me. Of course it wasn't clickbait. Jimmy was against Kim and made himself out to be the bad guy, in tremendous Saul Goodman fashion, genuinely conning her by using one of his signature commercials, which is such a great scene, but you can actually tell she's quite disturbed by this, as she's not used to being on the receiving end of these kinds of schemes. Mike also gets Lalo arrested by putting in a tip for the murder of Fred Whalen, which is pretty great. I mean, with long-running shows, sometimes writers tend to forget about rando characters dying, and they don't ever address like an investigation or anything into these like details, even though there really should be consequences for such actions. So I'm glad this is how Lalo is arrested, and it sets up some great stuff for season 5. And to subvert our expectations about the title even further, instead of their relationship being over, Kim suggests that they actually get married. Also, I know I've said it before, but Rhea Seehorn is an amazing actress, and she absolutely went off in this scene. Number 10. Winner. The finale of Season 4, Episode 40, Winner. We get the scheme of Jimmy trying to win over the people at the bar by feigning remorse over his brother's death, which he does through an elaborate set of tricks. But as the episode goes on, you can start to feel like it is real, at least somewhat. that Jimmy really is in pain over the loss, even if he pretends like it doesn't bother him, culminating in Jimmy abandoning the idea of reading Chuck's personal letter and having a heartfelt moment, which even makes Kim tear up and results in Jimmy being reinstated. It's only after we get out of the room that we realize Jimmy, or should I say Saul, has conned us all, including Kim dropping this iconic line.
Jimmy, what?
It's all good, man.
Showing that the old Jimmy was gone, and that Saul Goodman was here to stay. Fantastically acted and built up sequence. What a character milestone. Also, the rest of the episode outside of this plot was solid too. Of course, there's the ongoing Werner storyline, which ends in a tragic scene in which Mike has to kill his first innocent, in quotes, person in the form of his friend. Also, a super underrated part in this episode is the chase scene between Mike and Lalo. What a brilliant escape by Mike. This is the kind of interesting and unpredictable writing that I live for in this show. You think he's reaching for a gun, but then he starts chewing gum. Like, how do you even come up with this stuff? And it makes sense. Mike would do this because he did have a job as a parking ticket guy. Incredible stuff. Just an amazing season finale.
Hey, Kid Named Finger, if that's your real name, congratulations on passing the Ohio State bar.
Number 9. Breaking Bad. Yeah, oh wow, just what an episode. Let me just say off the bat, the title of the episode is a cool callback to Season 2 Episode 8 of Breaking Bad, titled Better Call Saul, which is where Saul is introduced. Same here, except reverse. It's cute, you know? And obviously, it pretty much goes without saying, but great cameo appearances here. Really fun dialogue and some great banter, and additional context for this scene in Breaking Bad. I absolutely loved it. Jesse's looking a bit old here, that's alright, though it just looks like he went through like a time machine before getting into the RV. But Walt looks pretty much exactly the same, so that's awesome. And I've said this once before, but yeah, this episode is so much more than just one scene. It's much more than just the cameos, even if the title suggests otherwise. We get the return of Victor St. Clair for another fun caper setup, with Jeff, Buddy, and Gene stealing information from random guys to sell for a profit. Also, the music in this episode slapped. The phone booth sequence also reminded me of Goodfellas too a little bit. Also, there was just overall really clean editing and transition work this episode. Really good stuff. We also get additional Breaking Bad context with Mike and Saul learning about Walter White, and Saul going against Mike's advice and pursuing Walt, showing that he really does crave that danger and can't seem to really get away from that kind of life. And this is intercut with shots of him in the present time risking it all just to break into this guy's house who also has cancer just to make a few bucks. But is that really what it's about for Jimmy? Of course not. I really just feel like this dude on some level wanted to get caught here. Number 8. Waterworks. Get ready because this one's a doozy. The penultimate episode of the entire series feels like a slow burn for the first half, but in the second half it ramps up before crashing into one of the most heart-wrenching scenes of the entire show. First, we get the stuff with Kim, which, as I said, is slow, but it's deliberate. And the dialogue in pretty much all of the Florida scenes is pretty stilted and awkward, but I'm pretty sure this was by design, to make Kim just feel really out of place. And it's sad seeing where she ends up, in a place where she can't even have an opinion about anything, even mayo, like bruh. Also, I thought it was a great subversion that it wasn't Kim scolding Saul, but the other way around. And it's also interesting that Kim actually does end up taking her own advice that she suggests to Jimmy, which does influence his decisions in the final episode. Also, the bus breakdown scene, hats off to Rhea. Some of her best acting in the entire series, hands down. Back in the Breaking Bad timeline, we have an Emilio cameo. Shout out to this guy, I've been waiting for him to make an appearance. Also, it's just so wild to see Jesse, of all people, have an interaction with Kim. That's like something people were memeing about, but it actually happened, and it was actually good. Also, definitely expected Saul to be arrested for the robbery and not Jeff. Just so many subversions this episode. But boy, that ending, what a roller coaster of emotions. It had my heart pumping, even believing for a second that Jimmy would sink low enough to kill this poor old woman, like holy hell. Also, it's fitting that it is an elder that causes his downfall. It really all just goes full circle. Probably one of the most shocking endings to any episode, and probably the most depressing one of the series. Number 7. Nippy. I'll say it right now. I think Nippy is the most underrated episode of the whole series. Maybe second most, but we'll get to that soon. Anyway, there are some people that don't like this episode. Some people think it's filler, some think it's boring, but honestly, I think it immediately became one of my favorites and instantly iconic. I mean, I don't think I'm ever gonna forget.
Go, 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 go! One, Armani suits and run!
Seriously though, what a fun episode. It's a great premise, and I love that it featured this one heist, which is such a tense watch, as at this point we don't have the security of Breaking Bad. We have no idea what happens to Jimmy, or sorry, Gene at this point in time. And Slippin' Jeffy, that only made that feeling way worse. Honestly, it is hilarious, but it's also a very stressful scene. And I just love how smug Jeff is after the whole thing. Now, of course, I do have to talk about the Jeff recasting, as a lot of people were rightfully upset by this, including myself. I mean, not that Pat Healy doesn't do a good job, he really does in these episodes, and I've really grown to like his character and performance, but it just doesn't seem like the same character that Don Harvey was portraying. Like in season 5, Jeff was charismatic and ominous, but also kind of playful, whereas this new version of Jeff is almost the opposite. But maybe that was the intended effect, as Jeff was being confronted in the comfort of his own home where he no longer had the upper hand as he once did in a public shopping mall next to his friend. Still though, I really loved this episode, even if people do dub it the Fly of Better Call Saul. It remains one of my favorites of the whole series. Number 6. Rockin' Hard Place. What a tragic and shocking episode. This is Nacho's episode straight up. And watching it from the beginning, and even from the start of the season, it just feels like there's no way this dude is going to die. At least not yet. He lived through so much, even in just this one episode, just for it all to end just like that. And I guess that's what really makes it shocking, even though they straight up tell us what's going to happen. It's still crazy to see play out. Besides the obviously wild ending scene, some standout scenes for me are the phone call with his father, as well as the sort of oil baptism that Nacho does in order to hide from the Salamancas. Then what can be said of the ending? I mean, there really isn't much to say other than it's just a satisfying way for him to go out, on his own terms, owning up to everything he's done and saving his father's life. What a Chad. RIP. Number 5. Chicanery. Before season 4 even aired, this was the episode of Better Call Saul, the one that everyone knew and remembered, and it's still recognized even after all that's happened as one of the best episodes of the series. Most of this episode is devoted to just the court case between Jimmy and Chuck, and is the culmination of their brewing conflict through the past 3 seasons, which all comes together nicely here, playing out like a chess match, each thinking they have the upper hand over each other until that final outburst by Chuck which seals his fate, provoked by the schemes of Jimmy in planting a battery on him. It's a character-defining moment for Chuck, and it's incredibly acted by Michael McKean, who really is not praised enough for his work on this show. Also forgot to mention that this is the first return of our boy Huel. Yeah, so when's that spin-off dropping, Vince? Can't wait. In all seriousness, this is a great episode almost just tied to one location and scene, which plays out like one of those old court dramas, but in a much more interesting and cathartic way, as we've had multiple seasons of build-up leading to this inevitable conflict. And it's just so satisfying to see the smug Chuck finally get what's coming to him. Number 4. JMM. Okay, so yeah, this is the most underrated episode of the series in my opinion, unless you count Nippy in that discussion. Sure, it does have high ratings on IMDb, but it's not even close to some of the other episodes in this top 10. We get Saul representing Lalo in the case of Fred Whalen's murder, making him a friend of the cartel, which is great stuff. And we also see Kim and Jimmy get married, which is sweet. Even Huel's there for the wedding, taking pictures. Also, Nacho and Gus blow up Los Pollos, which is
acceptable.
And then of course there is the Jimmy and Howard courthouse part. And I could go on and on about this scene. First of all, this shot is astounding, and the conversation that follows is even better. We get Jimmy calling Howard unhinged at his accusations, followed by Jimmy going on an absolutely bombastic rant, only for Howard to be the bigger man and walk away, as Jimmy continues to rant and rave like an actual madman, only returning to reality after the theatrics are over and softly and quietly walking away. This scene really is the pinnacle of Jimmy's pent-up emotions, as well as his relationship with Howard, which is intertwined with his guilt over Chuck's death, which he pushes onto Howard, which creates a domino effect resulting in Howard's death at the hands of Lalo. And to call this scene fantastic would be an understatement, and I tend to go back to this scene more than any other in the whole series.
Whatever it is, it's not for me, and it shouldn't be for you.
Hey, you forget your key? Oh.
Number 3. Saul Gone. Alright, so here we have the series finale. I know, a lot of you are probably wondering why it's not number 1, and some of you may think that it's even too high. But don't worry, I've got quite a bit to say about it. Maybe more than any other episode. First of all, let me just get this out of the way. I think this is a really great episode of television. It's shot well, it's directed well, and it ends the story of Jimmy McGill beautifully. However, I don't think that it's perfect, and I do have some small issues with it personally, despite it being one of my favorite episodes of the series, as well as a great way to end the Better Call Saul / Breaking Bad universe as a whole. First, let me just say I really love the opening scene. It was a pleasant surprise to see a flashback to Bagman as the first scene, and seeing Mike one last time was nice. Although, as I'll get into later, I'm not too sure how to feel about these flashback segments, but the one with Mike is fine. Next, we get Gene getting caught in the dumpster, which is great and was foreshadowed in the season 6 opener. Okay, now time for a hot take, and feel free to disagree with me here, but I'm not the biggest fan of this Walt and Saul scene. I don't know, it just goes on for so long, and we don't really learn anything other than that Saul can't admit his regrets, which is what the other flashbacks also tell us. And here Walt is just being an insufferable prick, and it's like, yeah, he was like that during this time, but it honestly just comes off kind of like parody. It's just a little too much, you know? And this line.
So you were always like this?
This is just kind of insulting. Like, bruh, you've literally killed hundreds of people. What are you talking about? And don't get me wrong, I love Walt, and it's not Bryan Cranston's fault. He's an amazing actor, obviously. But I don't know, this scene just kind of annoys me a bit. It really just doesn't feel similar to the scenes in Breaking Bad that supposedly took place during that same time. But I don't know, that might just be me. Overall though, I really do like this episode and the theme of regrets here. The Chuck flashback is nice, although there are some minor inconsistencies in chronology here, but it's not too important. The courtroom scene though is fantastic. Amazing acting by Bob, and some of these lines are just great and really get you in the feels.
But that thing with your brother, that wasn't even a crime.
It was.
Also, I will never forget that courtroom entrance, coming in as Saul Goodman and leaving as Jimmy McGill. One of my favorite shots of the entire series. Alright, nitpick time again. I'm sorry, but I really wish we would have returned to color at some point in this episode. Either when Kim visited, or when he left the courtroom, or even when he confessed. We get a glimpse of color in the cigarette, but that's about it. Although Kim's final reunion with Jimmy is nice. And I love that Saul also got to come out one final time to get him a 7-year deal, which he doesn't end up taking, upon hearing that Kim has confessed herself. And the bus scene, some people aren't fans of it, but honestly I really like it. It really shows that even after everything, you can't escape the things you've done. But that goes both ways, so even though he'll be known and remembered as Saul, he'll most likely be fine in prison. So yeah, it was a great finale. It didn't end in bombastic fashion like Breaking Bad and many other TV dramas, but it was satisfying and cathartic nonetheless, and I can say I'm happy with the overall outcome. Also, side note, these suit cinematic things they had at the beginning and ending were great. Big fan of those. Number 2. Point and Shoot. The devastating aftermath of Howard's death at the hands of Lalo. That's what I was expecting from this episode when it came out. But when I actually watched it, I was completely blown away by how much actually happens in such a short amount of time. I don't think I've ever seen an episode of television seem like it lasted as long as this one did. It's also an incredibly eerie and just creepy episode in terms of tone and atmosphere. Even after Lalo is finally killed, that dread still kind of hangs over the whole thing, and I really love that. Also, there are quite a few great callbacks this episode, like Gale's death from Breaking Bad, as well as Walt going to Gus's house to kill him, similar to how Kim attempted. and even the "it wasn't me, it was Ignacio" line. And of course, despite the beginning part being pretty unpredictable, with Lalo sending Kim to kill Gus, the rest of it was foreshadowed heavily, and so the theories were true, with Gus hiding the gun in the lab for his inevitable confrontation with Lalo. But still, even knowing all of that going in, this scene is just incredibly well executed. What an interesting and abrupt way to kill a villain. Great death scene, great character. Also, this episode follows that cool naming trend of having multiple meanings, both literal and not, such as Lalo telling Kim it's as easy as point and shoot with her gun, when Gus actually follows that same advice to kill Lalo with a similar gun. And it could also even refer to the camera that Lalo was using as well, showing everything that Gus was behind, as well as his confession to Don Eladio, which was something great that they were able to put in because we never got to see his full thoughts on him in Breaking Bad. Also, that ending scene, wow, is that powerful. It's just absolutely crazy seeing the two major antagonists of the series from both sides, the law and the cartel, being buried together in the same place that is pretty much the main center stage, literally laying the groundwork for Breaking Bad. Amazing episode, and there's only one that I think really tops it. Number 1. Plan and Execution. And for our number 1 spot, the best episode of Better Call Saul, in my opinion, is hands down Plan and Execution. This one wasn't too hard to decide, unlike the top 10 or even all of the other entries. This episode has pretty much been cemented as my favorite since it was initially released. I mean, this episode has a 9.9 out of 10 on IMDb, the highest rating of all the episodes, and for good reason. Where do I even start? I guess we'll begin with, well, the beginning Lalo stuff, because it's short but sweet. And of course, when we see the cockroach, we immediately know that Lalo is after Jimmy, referencing what he said about him in Bagman. That's why it's surprising that we see Howard show up initially, and we're honestly relieved as we get Howard's final venting scene, explaining what's wrong with Jimmy and Kim, which is great in its own right. I haven't talked about it much, but Howard really was a good guy who just found himself in bad circumstances, caught between a brutal relationship of two brothers trying to hurt each other, which ended up being his downfall. It's sad, really. Oh, and of course we have to mention the scam, or scheme, con, whatever you want to call it. I'll say it now, I think it's the best in the series. It's so incredibly convoluted and great to watch, but also heartbreaking, seeing Howard deteriorate mentally in front of everyone. Similar to Chuck, but this time even worse. Anyway, by this point in the episode, I already would have easily had it in my top 10, or maybe even top 5. But of course, it doesn't end there. The candle flickers for a second time and we see Lalo enter the room. And when you're watching this show, it almost feels like you are actually watching two at the same time. One, a grounded lawyer drama with a little comedy and tragedy sprinkled in, and the other a cartel-driven crime drama that is closer to something like Breaking Bad. So watching these two worlds collide here in this episode almost feels like a crossover, as the stories felt so different, with Jimmy as the only anchor connecting the two. Well, not anymore. And of course we know what happens next, as Lalo kills Howard in what can only be described as one of the most shocking and brutal deaths in any TV show I've ever seen. But that's not the saddest part. The saddest part is that it will be covered up, his legacy tarnished after everything that Jimmy and Kim did. That's why I really like that scene with the soda can, because in a way it represents Howard screwing on the silencer himself of the gun that killed him. Because in his own tragic way, the man who had the most to say silenced himself, taking away his voice and his legacy. An unforgettable work of television, and in my opinion, the best episode of Better Call Saul. And that is going to wrap it up for this video. I know it was a long one and not something I typically talk about on the channel, but I still thank you all for watching. I had a really fun time making this video on a show that will forever be one of my favorites, even if it's the lesser recognized and appreciated of these two behemoth TV shows. Also, please let me know your feedback in the comments down below, and share your thoughts on any of all the episodes. What you agreed with or disagreed with, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Or even if you'd like to give your own list, at least a top 10 or top 5 episodes, let me know as well. I'd love to see what you guys think now that the dust has settled with this show. Anyways, that's all for now. Expect some more videos coming very soon, and this has been me, sourcebrew, and I will see you all with the next one. Peace.